We are live.
It's YouTube Music. Download the app today and get a trial of Music Premium on us. Restrictions apply.
evening, everyone, and welcome to Conversations Cafe, Spark the Conversation. I am your host, Carl Evans, Senior Director of Operations at Hope for the Day. And we are super excited to bring this episode to you. It's one that we've been looking forward to running for quite a while, and it's perfectly concurrent with current times and issues and topics of the day, but it's also just regardless of what time frame we might have this conversation. It's essential to have because it's part of a bigger and broader conversation on the ongoing innovations and growth of the mental health spectrum, treatments, and viewpoints and perspectives and getting involved. And when we talk about Spark the Conversation, tonight what we're really talking about in a way that I don't want anyone to roll their eyes at is we're talking about drugs tonight, to put it simply. But and what I want to do is have a full-throated conversation on when we hear even the word drugs is stigmatized. And if you have ever been a part of any Conversations Cafe or any work with Hope for the Day in our education space, you know that our biggest sort of obstacle to effective conversations and treatments and progress on mental health is based on confronting stigmas that silence conversation, disrupt understanding, and create further obstacles to improving overall mental health states. And unfortunately, when we talk about the world that's under the context of drugs, we're talking about a world that is rife with stigmas of no passive accident, many very much deliberate. What I would like to point out is when we talk about a full-throated conversation on this topic, I'm going to be referring to these things by their technical names, their street names, but I'm also largely considering them tools that were largely dismissed. And even though we're in the middle of social and scientific realities that are progressing our understanding, it's been so muddled by stigmas that it's important to sort of set the ground tone. When we talk about alternatives, even that is stigmatizing. When we talk about alternative substances and resources to deal with our mental health under the sort of term of drugs, we might appreciate that there's pharmacological options. But when I talk about drugs, I'm also talking about things such as marijuana, CBD, ketamine, among other elements and other tools. And if we were to just focus on the idea of marijuana and CBD, which have two sort of different chambers of application, but need to be sort of addressed in the same way, you wouldn't have to look that much further than, President Nixon's 1971 declaration that there's going to be a war on drugs, which fueled mass incarceration and was the sort of building catharsis for the intensification of policing in urban spaces. And I bring up the war on drugs issue in 1971 because by Nixon architects of the war on drugs, such as John Daniel Ehrlichman, who was a counsel and assistant to Nixon on domestic affairs, he straight up said that the very marketing and branding of the idea of war on drugs was specifically to target two threatening voting groups to Richard Nixon's success, which was Black communities and youth groups that were collectively or pejoratively called hippies, which I'm sure we might all sort of casually know the term hippies. That isn't, however, the first time that drugs were used to stigmatize and quantify and coalesce whole populations into sort of a negative perception. We can see as early back as the 1920s and specifically around 1930s, drug laws against narcotics that included marijuana. And I bring that up not just because it was well-meaning, but really the sort of one of the grandfathers of American drug prohibition is a guy named Harry Jacob Anslinger, who served under Hoover, FDR, Eisenhower, I think even all the way up to Johnson. And he, in 1933, when talking about cannabis, basically wanted it to be illegal, the recreational use of cannabis to be illegal, because it was a way to sort of correlate that it was a drug of African Americans and Negroes. And if whites in America were to use it, it would it would propel them to commit violent crimes and act irrationally, become overly sexual. Um, and if we, so there's this long basis for stigmatizing drugs, not just on the idea of are they healthy or harmful for your body, which is a perfectly valid way to have a discussion about any sort of substance or sources that are out there that we could take. But that there was this very specific and conscious social factor that played into describing and designing what was going to become illegal or not illegal. Um, One of the things that we look at now is there was a recent poll by Marist and Yahoo News in 2017 that found that nearly 55 million adults in America believe they are or have attested to actively using or casually using marijuana. And when we talk about that substance as a tool, you probably have a general idea. Marijuana is a psychoactive substance. It contains THC. It can produce any number of different effects. It can be smoked. It can be ingested. But a really interesting thing about it is that we know from a scientific standpoint, there's been research that does show that marijuana use, for instance, and you see a lot of this from like a news standpoint, that we'll see people sort of promote the idea that marijuana is harmful, and there is legitimate research out there that shows that marijuana can induce psychosis. It can lead to and trigger or be correlated to exasperating schizophrenic and bipolar disorders. There's consistent research that in some persons and some uses it can trigger anxiety, panic, depression, paranoia, and confusion. And why I bring that up is because, like I said, we need to have a full-throated, honest conversation. But I also bring that up because if you start to look at research around marijuana, there's been a lot of research focused on, does it harm individuals? But that almost creates an optical disparity between asking the question, can it help individuals? Because in consistent research, we found that many people discuss and describe using marijuana because it provides a calming or sedating effect. And that's the plant base of marijuana. That's not necessarily what CBD is. CBD is one of 113 of these things called cannabinoids that are found in cannabis plants. And CBD is one variation that's the one that's sort of approved and it's popular. And I'm not going to go into all the other ones. You can Google that stuff. And we're going to have some experts on who can talk to the very specifics and science background of what CBD is and what's going on with it. But I want to bring CBD up because when we're talking about, there's the medicinal application of marijuana, but then and the recreational approval now in some states of marijuana. And then there's this discussion of applications of CBD to certain things. And some people might be confused or think that plant marijuana, the stuff that's been smoked recreationally, talked about for decades and decades and decades, is the exact same thing as when somebody talks about CBD, and that's not true. They're two very distinct things, and we're going to have fantastic guests on today who are going to be able to help articulate those distinctions. But I bring that up because CBD is also a place where we've seen an intensive level of scientific research go into asking questions. Can CBD be positive? Can it be good? And there has, even though a universal consensus isn't out there to sign off on it, there's more than enough strong data to suggest that there are positive uses for CBD. And quite frankly, even though, again, there's not a universal consensus that plant-based marijuana has some positive uses. I'd be irresponsible, though, in not mentioning that there is a risk of using any sort of chemical or substance that particularly can impact your psychological state, especially when you're a minor or someone under the ages of 24 and 25, where your brain and specifically your frontal lobes are still developing in such a way that it's hard to anticipate or predict what could happen. And that would be true from whether it's marijuana or alcohol use, or huffing paint, for God's sakes, which is not to be thought of in the same way. But when we talk about drugs, it's important that I'm not trying to limit this discussion to just one thing or another. And it's important to understand that people can make a distinction in a solid case for, hey, this is something that can be used for positive effects. This is something that probably may only have detrimental effects and be harmful ultimately. And I don't want to pretend like there aren't the two out there, which is kind of how stigmatization on drugs has worked, is that it's all evil and it's all bad, it's all going to destroy you. And so all these things belong in a dark closeted blanket. And that's the same way that we look at other substances out there, things that might have been broadly called in the world of hallucinatory type drugs. And I think of the product ketamine, which has a reputation as an illicit substance that can be almost psychedelic and things like that. When we talk about ketamine, it's something that's been around and produced, since the early 60s. And it was something that was even used for anesthesia and pain relief in surgery throughout the 60s, and even applied to soldiers in the field in Vietnam, for America throughout the 60s. The FDA approved ketamine as a battlefield anesthetic, and it was even then in the 70s applied or expanded into use in veterinary applications. But aside from that, it's also contained, like other hallucinatory drugs that may have started from a medical application before, have also been sort of stigmatized and dismissed and considered part of a drug culture because of its street or civilian applications. And it wasn't really until researchers at the University of Yale started asking again the question, okay, there's a lot of stigma around these things. And even if its origins had a medical origin, a lot of people, and I'm talking about in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, look at things like ketamine and think, well, it's just an illicit drug. It can do no good for you. And let's just keep it illegal, and that's that. And it was research at the University of Yale that asked the simple question, could it be good? And they started to find connections that it might actually be supportive for depression. And there we see by 2016 an advancement in research that the National Institute of Mental Health even published in back journal findings that found that controlled doses of ketamine could actually work faster and provide an even more intensive positive impact for people experiencing clinical depression than current and existing antidepressant drugs. And as recently as March 5th, 2018, after nearly 20 years of research, an actual FDA-approved application of ketamine is available in the medical market for treatment of depression. And so I bring all that up because what we're going to talk about is really complicated and packed with a lot of different baggage around social, cultural, and legal realities. But it's also something that's critical to improving mental health, because over the last 30 years, we've watched institutional understanding dramatically shift in all different phases of mental health. What it is, who is impacted by mental illnesses, what can we do to treat mental illnesses. This has gone from everything from applying who can have PTSD to what is anxiety, does generalized anxiety even exist, to understanding and evolving our frame of reference for things like bipolar disorder. And so it's part and parcel with that the tools we use to combat, treat, support, and improve mental health in our country are also going through the same experiences, except that when we start talking about these tools, specifically the collective tools that are part of the drugs and applications, they're carrying so much intensive sociocultural baggage that's directly linked to things around systemic racism that they have, an intensely harder hill to climb. But here we are in 2020, in which we are watching recreational and medicinal dispensaries open up in states that have approved these laws, and we're watching people make industry out of it. We're finding people gain access to these tools once and for all, but we're also finding these new evolutions in the wake of a lot of bodies that are incarcerated, a lot of families and a lot of communities that have been decimated by not the drugs, but the policies that have compelled the drugs to be put into certain spaces. So we're going to get this episode rocking and rolling with a really amazing group of guests who are going to be talking about all different intersections in this episode of Spark the Conversation. And so let's, without further ado, get them on screen now. We have a number of folks to introduce, and then they're going to tell you a little bit about themselves, and we're going to get rocking and rolling. So first, our first guest, let's see if we can get Alia on. Alia, can we see you? Can we hear you?
Hi, Carl.
Hi, Alia. Thank you for joining us. Next up, we've got Allison. Allison, can we see you? Can we hear you?
Hello.
There's Alia. And we got next is Allison. Hello, Allison. Dr. Felty, can we see you? Can we hear you? And make sure we can get everyone visual on the screen. Hello, there you are.
Hello.
Daniel Carcillo, can we see you? Can we hear you? Get unmute there. Dan, do we see you? There you are. Hey, thanks for joining us. Michelle, can you up? See you? There you are. Hey, Michelle. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Loud and
Awesome.
clear. And then Patrick, can we hear you? Can we see you? Perfect.
Good evening.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Such a lovely panel of guests. And first and foremost, I want our audience to sort of catch the vibe and get the 411 from all of you. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go in reverse order and start with Patrick. Why don't you give us a little bit of the elevator, tell us about yourself and how you connect to this topic.
Absolutely. Thanks, Carl. A wonderful monologue. I'm Nature's Grace and Wellness. Our family got into cannabis in 2014, 2015 in the state of Illinois with the state of Illinois' medical marijuana compassionate pilot program. It has been a wild ride for us. With the very beginning, we started in a program with just, I believe, around 40 conditions. So a very conservative medical marijuana program here in the state of Illinois. And from there, we've seen proportional growth in our marketplace that's been really spurred along by a change in administration with a more progressive governor. And as many of you know, an adult use recreational program that was passed into law last summer and went live on Jan 1 of 2020 this year. So it's been a busy time. Our family's background is in agriculture, in beef cattle, corn, and soybeans. So for roughly 5 generations, we've been protein producers, and we saw an opportunity to diversify our agriculture exposure into cannabis, albeit a very different type of agriculture. Largely a more significant driving reason is family issues. We have members of our family that benefit from cannabis medically, involving conditions such as MS and epilepsy. But nevertheless, it's been a steep learning curve for us, albeit, we're up for the task, but it's been a fun time. So.
Thank you, Patrick. Really appreciate that. And thank you for joining us. Dr. Felty.
Hi there. I'm Cresencia. I'm a naturopathic doctor, and I love this topic. I started with cannabis and researching in CBD and how it can reduce inflammation in the body about 10 years ago. And now I'm on to psilocybin and how that can really help treat anxiety, depression, resolve trauma. And I'm getting involved in psychedelic psilocybin retreats starting next year. And then also I really want to dive into palliative care, so helping people at end of life, so that way they have hope and leave this world on a beautiful note.
And thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to ask real quick before we move forward, because I always want our audience to feel like they're right there with us. Can you just articulate a little bit on psilocybin and what that means?
Yeah, of course. So it was known as the flesh of the gods by the ancient Aztecs. It's been used in absolutely every culture. Uh, the shamans around the world have used psilocybin, and psilocybin comes from magic mushrooms. It's a species of mushrooms. It's many species of mushrooms that's naturally grown from the earth. And what it does is it's been used in ceremonies to help with religious insight, healing, and resolving trauma, along with having transcendental experiences.
Thank you. And again, I just, I wanted to make sure so that people understand this discussion is not just exclusive to cannabis. And I mentioned ketamine, but it's important that we understand there's actually any number of tools out there. And it's likely that if it wasn't something I talked about in open monologue, it could have easily just been as stigmatized too. So I just want to make sure we understand all these things need to be validated as we hear them. Michelle, thank you for joining us.
Hi, my name is Michelle Thompkins. I'm from the South Side of Chicago. I am a mother. I'm the founder of the Cornerstore, which is a youth mental health and wellness-based organization, and our aim is to connect youth to many different mental health resources and creative art outlets. I'm very excited about this conversation today because it's very important for me that my community is afforded the opportunity to have a conversation on other treatments, other holistic treatments, as well as, giving us a seat at the table, getting folks out of prison and jail systems who are in there for petty crimes and who are in there for less than an ounce of weed. I want to be able to support that conversation, and I want youth to be able to know that there are other alternatives, especially first graders who are put on IEPs at the age of 6, and there isn't any type of conversation. So I'm very excited to be here. Thank you so much to Carl, to Mike, and everyone at Hope for the Day.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Next up, Daniel.
Hi, everyone. Daniel Carcillo. In my former life, I played hockey for 12 years. When I retired in 2015, I retired because of post-concussion syndrome. I was dealing with symptoms like anxiety, depression, head pressure, headaches, memory loss, concentration, focus issues, as well as impulse control issues and insomnia. And for 4 years, I tried pretty much every single treatment there was as far as going to these concussion clinics and trying to promote neuroplasticity, creating new connections in my brain. And I'd spent over $200,000 after 4 years and nothing was working. Last year, June 1, I took a QEEG and that kind of confirmed that the money that I'd spent and the things that I was doing I was not seeing any major gains. And luckily I got invited to a farm in Colorado to learn about CBD genetics. And I was surprised with a ceremony, a psilocybin ceremony, a hero dose, which is 5 grams, and a big enough dose to basically break up the destructive thought patterns that I was stuck in. And after that ceremony, I came back to Illinois. I farmed for the next 4 months, 750 plants, and harvested about 200 pounds last year. And I've turned that into medicine now because of how this medicine has impacted my life. When I came back, I started on a CBD regimen with 6 functional mushrooms like lion's mane, reishi, cordyceps, turkey tail, chaga, and agarikon. And I also started on a microdose regimen of psilocybin. So that is taking a subperceptual dose once every 3rd day, or there's 2 other protocols that are 4 days on, 3 days off, or 5 days on, 2 days off. And at the 6-month mark, I rechecked my QEEG, which is a brain scan, and my blood work, and I had no abnormalities at the 6-month mark. I just redid it June 1. And continue to see really great results. And so I use CBD and these functional mushrooms along with the microdose as a tool as well as intermittent fasting, watching my alcohol intake and my refined white sugar intake, and really as a holistic lifestyle tool. And it's allowed me to regain my health. It's allowed me to regain my relationships with my kids and my wife, and with my family members and friends around me. It's made me more patient, more loving, more understanding, more creative. And I'm able to multitask and do things that I just wasn't able to do a year ago. And because it impacted my life so much, I brought forward a national movement that is happening around the country, which is called Decriminalize Nature, more specifically Decriminalize Nature Chicago, which is a resolution that will decriminalize all entheogenic plants, not all of them, but we're starting with 4 of them: cacti, ayahuasca, psilocybin, and iboga or ibogaine. And I feel really passionately that this saved my life. I was having suicidal thoughts last year, June 1, and it's just totally changed everything about my life and my relationships. So I feel that I have now an obligation to get this information. We call it alternative medicine. I call it original medicine, and it's about restoring our inalienable right to use nature as medicine, and to start understanding and seeing when our quality of life is being affected by certain mental health conditions, and how we can treat ourselves in a responsible manner.
Hell yeah. Thank you, Daniel. Next up, Allison.
Hey, I'm Allison. So I took Hope for the Day's mental health education back in 2018, and then kind of never stopped learning. I've been volunteering with Hope for the Day officially since like late 2018. And I'm also, I have a background in harm reduction, and I have naloxone or Narcan training through Chicago Recovery Alliance. So yeah, I have a good understanding of like a public health experience when it comes to substance use, and educating people on when they ingest substances, what they're doing. Because I know a lot of people have those experiences in their teen years and in college when they're kind of going through drinking and understanding how alcohol works. But when it comes to other substances, people have no idea what they're doing. And I think education is the most important part.
Thank you for joining us, Allison. And Aaliyah. What's good, Aaliyah?
Hi, everyone. My name is Alia Reichert, and I work for Nature's Grace and Wellness, and I am the education associate there. My main job is to just be able to go around and talk to people about cannabis and mental health. So we started the program called Spark the Conversation, and we're hoping just to be able to reach as many communities as possible and just talk about the importance of both and destigmatize both. So my personal journey specifically with cannabis is that I started using cannabis probably about 10 years ago or so, on and off, just to help me with my anxiety and depression that I had. I also do have PTSD. So it kind of just quells the chaos, and it just helps me focus and feel like more of a baseline feeling. Currently, I do some research at Nature's Grace and Wellness for different topics about cannabis, just to see how it's impacting people and how it helps our bodies, and is also sometimes detrimental as well, as Carl, you said earlier. Because we want to know all the pros and cons that we can have to work with it, and be able to talk to people in a smart way and be able to share information with them. Before working at Nature's Grace, I worked at a dispensary. So I was a patient care specialist. And I would talk with patients, this was before it went recreational, talk with patients every day and give them suggestions of how they could use products, how they could dose it properly, in different ways that they could use it, because a lot of people that came in, would just think of the regular old school way of just smoking cannabis, as opposed to being able to use it topically or, as a tincture or things like that. So it was a learning curve for a lot of people, and plus the strains are much stronger than they had been back in the day for those people that are in that older generation, to let them know that they need to use it responsibly, because it's not the same strength as it used to be. And, we want them to make sure that they don't go home and have a full-on anxiety attack or anything like that by using it improperly. And while I was there, I really wanted to reach out to be able to talk to people more about the benefits of cannabis and the proper usage, and also how that can correlate with mental health. Of course, it's not an end all be all, but it can be helpful. Before that, I was a teacher.
Hell yeah. And so, thank you for you sharing your past experiences and where you currently are active. And this is really where I want to sort of start right from the tippy top here, is the fact that homeopathic, okay, an alternative in those terms. I like to think that in this realm, we're reclaiming things that were used as obstacles and dismissive. And why I say that is because if you look just 15 and 20 years ago, there were a lot of people, professionals, who were in a world who were using things like painting and music to try to break through people's mental health illnesses, challenges, and obstacles. And they probably couldn't get serious weight in private practice or hospital positions and things like that until a couple of professionals started applying this work to veterans. And all of a sudden, painting and drawing and singing to help a veteran communicate, connect, and push through some of their experiences, or even just start the conversation on traumatic experiences, suddenly, institutionally, people are like, oh, well, I guess art therapy is going to be a thing now, and we're just going to buy into it. And then it trickled into the civilian world. And unfortunately, part of the stigma that works around our cultures in which there's it's a male-based sort of authorship, the military realm is where a lot of mental health advancement starts, and it trickles to the civilian world through that. And with CBD, that process wasn't as streamlined. I think there was more of a civilian. Ketamine, however, was one place. And I bring up ketamine because it's the only substance that's really been dabbled with there, as opposed to when we think about mushrooms. And as I give fair warning, I'm going to be using technical and street terms. That's my reappropriation and reclaiming. So, boomers and shrooms and stuff like that has been a place that's not gotten the same appreciation. So where I'd like to start with all of you is, yes, there can be negative effects and all this kind of stuff, but let's talk about what is the legitimate. Is it all smoke and mirrors, or what the hell is really going on? I mean, Dan, you threw a lot of beautiful, direct, a lot of people only have qualitative experience, experiential, anecdotal data. My man over here talking about some blood tests and some brain scans. Was that when you first started on your journey, just so other people can hear it, did you know that was going to be a thing that could show up, or did you think like, all right, I'm going to try this because nothing else has worked, and if I go on some spiritual quest journey and feel a little bit better, cool. But did you think you were going to see doors open up for you in terms of better improvement? You're on mute, brother.
Sorry. Yeah, absolutely not. I think it was a sense where I was kind of backed into a corner and I really had nowhere else to go. It was a surprise, really. And then after the ceremony, and because of the way I felt, then I started to delve into the research that's been done by universities like Johns Hopkins, NYU, the Imperial College of London. And one of the most interesting images that I've thrown up on my Instagram is the way that the brain communicates when it's on a big dose of psilocybin. And the right and left brain hemispheres communicate at a rate that's never been seen before. And because I've studied the brain in these medical papers, trying to regain my brain health, I thought, wow, I keep hearing at these clinics about brain stimulation and neuroplasticity, and then I see it. I can actually see it. There was a study done in 2014 by the Imperial College of London, Robin Carhart-Harris, in partnership with Johns Hopkins University. And for me and for a lot of concussion patients, where they're finding CTE post-mortem in athletes' brains is in our frontal lobes. And where psilocybin works specifically is in our frontal lobes. And so it just I started making all of these connections. And the way I felt was the biggest indicator. And for me, I have to back this up with science, because that's what's leading the way. And that's what's really exciting about this industry, of the psychedelic industry, the entheogens industry, more so than, CBD and cannabis had an opportunity to do that. And I think that they missed the boat. And so I think that's where a lot of, and can appreciate what Alia's doing, and Patrick, as far as education, because if you have anxiety, then don't go smoke a 30% THC strain. It's not gonna end up well and don't take a 50 milligram edible. It's just like little things that they missed. And so I think, you know, if people know like that CBD, you can take CBD, big doses of CBD to quail those episodes if you have too much THC. Like not a lot of people know that. Not a lot of people know about the 1-to-1s. And so I always just, I love to track it, and I love people that get on this regimen to also track it with QEEGs. And yeah, it's a really exciting time, I think, to be alive and for what I've kind of stumbled upon, and then related it back to the TBI, mental health, mental illness community, as well as, you know, helping veterans and first responders with, you know, the trauma that some of these communities are experiencing, not only physical, but emotional. So yeah, there was a lot that kind of went into it.
And thank you for saying that too, because unfortunately, I think in being an advocate for these kind of things, being a professional athlete is, again, I think, cuts through an obstacle of stigmatization that if somebody's, let's say, in the civilian life and didn't have a visible experience, and let's say they've had concussions or something, and, you know, it's because they've worked a long time in retail and they turn to these things, people might create a hierarchy of like, well, I don't think, you know, and that's where data, you know, black and white data, unfortunately, does become critical. Alia, to that point, carrying over to CBD, and I also want to talk about plant too, and we'll come back to with Christina as well. How does that work in terms of finding access and education for people who maybe anecdotally were like, yeah, you know, CBD could work for me? You know, do you find that you have to do a lot of educational legwork, or yeah, I mean, just go from there. I don't want to prompt too much in, right?
No, that's fine. You know, there's research done, but it's not peer reviewed. It hasn't been, you know, like absolutely proven, just because of the federal legality of THC and CBD. I mean, the CBD has been a little bit more studied more, but it's mostly with hemp. But we do know that CBD can be an anti-inflammatory, so it can be really helpful for people that have, you know, things like arthritis and things like that. And it also can, in conjunction with the THC, like a 1-to-1, like Dan was saying, be very beneficial, because a little bit of THC and then the CBD combined together can actually help a lot with pain. So people that have like MS or you know, illnesses or ailments that have that strong pain threshold, especially like cancers, things like that, CBD can be really helpful. Now, you have to get it though from a legit source. You just can't go buy it at 7-Eleven. If you go buy the CBD at 7-Eleven, Walgreens, you have no idea what you're getting. It hasn't been tested, and it could just be, it's like snake oil, you know, because people would come in when I was working at the dispensary and they'd be like, well, why is this little tiny bottle of like 100 milligrams $60, and I could buy a giant vat of it on Amazon? I'm like, because it's not the same, you know. So that is really hard for people to kind of grasp, that it's not the same quality, and it's not the same, doesn't have the same medicinal purpose, you know, properties. So people, that education needs to be out there for people, because they're not willing to really go out there and look it up themselves. They just, you know, it's like a flash. They see it and they're like, okay, I'm going to try this, but they don't go to legit sources to have, you know, the proper dosage and have somebody explain to them like how it can actually be beneficial. And it doesn't just have to be, you know, ingested. It can be topical as well. It can be a 1-to-1 cream that could be very helpful to people too. So, you know, the CBD, there is more research on that end, just because there can be, but it's not it's not, you know, enough. We have to keep pushing to get it just federally legalized, so that we can actually study it properly. Because there's only 2 places that are allowed to grow in the United States that can actually be studied. One's the University of Mississippi. So they have a crop, and it's not a really good crop. So it's not like they have quality stuff either to kind of test. You know, they're not going to the O'Hearns or anybody else that have legit grows and getting that qualitative information from the data that they could do. They have their own grow, and it's like subpar. So
okay, that's important to know. And Dr. Felty, because you're working in this field where you get the very alternative and homeopathic terms, and those can kind of be used with like an eye roll. as a way for people to be afraid or hesitant to say like, hey, this could be stuff that's actually helping you. And it's actually, it's positive, it's medical, it's therapeutic, it's, so could you just sort of enlighten us a little bit about what your experiences have been with treating and engaging patients? And maybe even people who aren't familiar with, you tell somebody at a cocktail, if that's a real thing, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And what's that response?
Yeah. Well, first, I am in a program right now to become a psychedelic therapist and researcher. It is a program in California at the Integral Studies. And in my research and in this program, we are learning all about how to help educate patients and the community to reduce harm, to understand set and setting, whether that's at home with self administration or that's in a clinic. But personally, I'm really passionate about advocating the use of growing your own plants at home. So that way you can work on your own trauma at home. And that's really what I talk to patients about. I tell them that there has been research for the past 50, 60 years, and kind of piggybacking on the veterans, just in 2015, a research study was done saying that not only psilocybin, but also MDMA, ketamine, not as much, but MDMA and psilocybin help reduce suicidal thinking, rage, flashbacks, and help with interpersonal relationships for veterans because these medicines are used to help someone resolve trauma in a way that it's not so overwhelming. So teaching someone how to do that at home in a safe place and in a healing environment is really my number one goal and what I'm learning in this program. So if someone's dealing with mental health issues and who isn't, I know even for myself, I mean, that's really what got me into this is my own mental health issues, especially with psilocybin, kind of like you, Dan, just really helping heal my brain from PTSD and a lot of trauma that I really didn't even was aware that I was dealing with. But the mushrooms really helped teach me how to connect to the earth and connect to people in a different way. And I want to help people also be able to do that too, because once you can connect, you can feel whole again. So, my purpose in my practice with people is to really help them mind, body, and spirit, whatever that might be. And it might be completely individual. So, I might educate them on psilocybin or ketamine because ketamine is legal in Illinois. So, I might recommend that they do ketamine if they have resistant depression or if they have anxiety that's not being helped with the current medications that they're on. But along with that, I want to make sure that their gut health is right because you produce serotonin and dopamine and all the important neurotransmitters in your brain in your gut. Your microbiome is the foundation of your health and your mood. And that goes back to your mother's gut health and how stressed she was. And so I really look at someone's whole story and whole picture and try to help devise them a plan that's going to support their mind, body, and spirit. Because really, that's what it's all about. And not separating things. In a allopathic or conventional model, you see someone in parts, but everything is connected. And so we have to figure out why that part isn't working. And usually it's emotional, it's mental, it's spiritual in nature. And so I think that when I support someone in that way and we focus on getting to the root cause, they can heal themselves because that's really what everyone has is an inner healer. And I think these medicines really help bring that out.
Man, so you put some fire on there real quick, okay? And I want to point out though that a lot of this also connects to other parts of the stigma reality. I don't want these episodes to be like 4 or 5 hours long because there's a lot of deep diving to go into. But I just want to highlight something. When you're talking about gut health and your mother's gut health, a lot, unfortunately, of the reality around stigmatization is it's authored from different spaces. And if somebody says the term Western culture, okay, it doesn't matter because even Eastern culture, global culture has historically had a very much a paternal sort of male authored viewpoint. And why I bring that up is because when we get down to sciences and medical understandings and things like that about the human body, it's very much through the male gaze. And the idea that our mental health and our general development could have so many impacts inside of the womb, as opposed to a lot of the conversation being very much focused on the autonomous post-umbilical reality, which we continually find isn't necessarily the case. That doesn't have to be a nefarious, dark, misogynistic reality. It could actually be one by ignorance of just omission of not considering the impacts and realities that are happening in that development. Even though there might be well-studied, a well appreciation or a well of studies and research about like what's happening as you are going through the development process, as you're being born. I gotta tell you, for a lot of folks, because I literally got 2 text messages as you were talking about, like, are you telling me my mental health has something to do with like my mama's gut? Like, so, but that's part of the reality here. And I think that brings us into the sort of general social applications here. And I want to draw Michelle and Allison and Patrick in here. Also, starting with Michelle, again, substances, drugs, tools, resources. I think we'll talk about the institutional side of it, but gosh darn it, let's talk about people finding value or use in these things and just dealing with trying to navigate that usage in a society that obfuscates, makes it illegal, stigmatizes, put it in a box. I'd like you to, if you feel comfortable speaking to that, we'll start with Michelle.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the programs that I facilitate through the Cornerstore is we go to different middle schools and high schools, and we have group conversations on everything that umbrellas mental health and wellness, especially in urban communities. And to have a conversation on drugs, first of all, they're like, what, Miss Michelle, we having a conversation on drugs? Like, nobody gives us a chance to like actually give a perspective on what is this doing to our body? How is this going to affect us? What type of autonomy do they have to do the research to see what kind of effects it will have on their bodies? Because it is so negatively stigmatized and it's used as a way to police Black and brown bodies. So if a parent wants to do research on CBD for their child that's having behavioral issues, that mother then risks having someone in the school system or within her own family calling Child Protective Services for neglect. And that's just something that our community has experienced for God knows how long. So when you're talking to students about alternatives, it's like a third dimensional kind of conversation that you're having with them, because they're like, well, I have PTSD, so I'm just going to smoke until I get numb. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Going back to what Alia and Daniel was saying, well, there's ways that you can dose and there's ways that you can heal yourself along with the support of a medical professional. And so, for me, it's very disheartening to hear that there's so many youths and there's so many parents that are just completely not even open to it, or maybe they are open to it, but because they know of the different ramifications that it could have on exploring this journey, they don't even go down that road. And so instead, I know a friend of mine, she's a behavioral analyst, and she told me this exact story. She wanted to try CBD for her child who was having extreme behavioral issues. And because she gave her child something, she ended up having to have a larger conversation than it was completely necessary for. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done for our community. And hopefully for me, what we're doing now and what I can take with the students going into the fall is to let them know that there are alternatives. It is okay to explore those alternatives and to do the right research so that you know what you're putting into your body. The things that you're getting off the street, you don't know what that's laced with. You don't know what kind of effects that's going to have on your body, to the points that we do see kids overdose. So we do see kids completely misuse medicine that could really help and heal them.
And to that point, Michelle, I'm wondering, because the way you're talking about with the education, it's really got to throw kids for a loop who have grown up and have been socially conditioned to a culture that, only treats, and again, when you talk about things like cannabis, you only have two pictures. Like there's the criminalized picture, and at best, your most liberal picture, especially for kids of color is, you know, something that works in like the Bob Marley depiction, like basically reducing all of Bob Marley and all of Rasta culture and all of, you know, the Afro-Caribbean experience down to like, you know, a beanie, some colors and some pot and like a big doobie. But like, so when you talk and engage, you talk with the kids, do you ever get pushback or blowback from the adults who have had a longer time period in this sort of conditioning, you know, of attitudes about it?
Absolutely, because it's like, it's the idea of you don't want to plant a seed into a young person's head because maybe a relative has been thrown in jail for X amount of time for being caught with something that they weren't supposed to, or because it's not appropriate. And because a lot of times the adults and the circles that I move into, not always, but most times, they don't want to further do any harm to the students that are coming into the circle, because the students that I'm engaging with, these are the students who have racked up detentions that are on the tops of the administrators' minds because of behavioral issues. And so it's kind of like, pick the lesser of the two evils. We'll let you go so far to this conversation, but to have a holistic and honest conversation on medicine and plants and alternative treatments, I do get some pushback, and it's really interesting. But the way that I am, I'm like, well, why don't you sit in the conversation with us and you'll learn something too? And maybe I'll bring in an Alia, or I'll bring in a Daniel who can educate all of us, so that then you're able to see, well, wait a minute, this is actually beneficial. And it's not a detriment to our students. And in fact, it'll actually help our students who are in the circle, who are experiencing anxiety, PTSD, and the list just goes on and on and on.
Oh, that's perfect. And I think it's so crucial both for our listeners to hear and the folks that you're directly contacting with kids and youth, because, you know, there's either an absence of talking, period, or you're only getting this sort of one negative, you know, sort of really shaded and negatively colored, you know, sort of traffic and noise out there. And it makes me wonder sort of, first, Michelle, can you stay with us for a little bit longer, or do you have a time?
Absolutely.
Okay,
yeah, I was even going to say, I utilize my own personal mental health journey as a way to kind of break the ice for the adults and for the students. And I let them know I experienced an extreme amount of trauma in college, and I went through many different avenues to try to get healing and to try to find some type of solace. And I did see a holistic doctor, and I was able to have a conversation on cannabis and CBD and even mushrooms. And, you know, that ended up working better for me and for my genetic makeup. And so I share my story as a way of being like, hey, if you don't like your prescription medication, you do have the right to ask for a second opinion, or to ask for a lower dosage, or ask for all sorts of different things. And you see the eyes just like widen, and you're like, wait, what? You can actually ask, you can actually like have a conversation with your doctor, or you can actually go to someone and have this conversation, maybe with a parent, maybe with a trusted adult. Like, there's just so much work that has to be done.
Thank you for bringing that up, because that is going to need to be an entire standalone episode. Mike, make a note. We're going to need to like take an agency in your actual care. Lord knows on the medical side of you know, surgeries and things like that, but also in mental health care, taking agency and not just taking the first response sometimes is important. And I think that actually loops in here too, because chances are maybe there are people out there who may have, and I don't want to name any official pharmacological entities, but they can be finding themselves on a dosage of X, Y, or Z, X amount of milligrams, and it's not jiving for them. And maybe they read something on a blog, or maybe they read a research paper talking into something where we're talking from CBD to psilocybin to one. Daniel, both Dr. Felty and Daniel, you named some of the shrooms that some terms that I'd never even heard of, and I don't want to brutalize renaming them, but let's say some of those things, and we're going to recircle back to that, and maybe they want to ask somebody like, hey, maybe this could help me, and they don't know how to take the agency. Now we need to do a whole episode on that, but I wanted to put over Allison, you know, as in harm reduction. Unfortunately, fortunately, you know, at the brass of the tags of that's putting you out in the field in a place where we see a lot of unregulated, you know, substance use, in live events and places like that, where you have people who have, because of social conditioning, only really maybe collectively may only appreciate the recreational impact of it, or may only understand the substance in a purely recreational binge type capacity. So what have you seen from that level?
Yeah.
And what do you wish more folks knew beforehand?
Yeah. So how I got into harm reduction. So I went to raves starting in 2013, which is a little bit ago, but not as far back as like some of my friends who went in the 90s. But it's a conversation you have where somebody's like, yeah, I took MDMA and it was like crazy strong. I had this experience, versus somebody else being like, I also took that thing that someone said was MDMA and nothing happened to me. And then having this conversation of like, because things are unregulated, because you don't know what stuff is, was it the same thing? And then some people have really horrible experiences and they'll never do it again. Like I've had people who have had edibles and talk to me and they're like, that's the worst thing ever, don't do that. But exactly what Daniel said earlier, if you're taking something that's way too strong for you, of course it's not going to go well. But yeah, it's just part of the education. I also had a conversation with someone, because usually when people are like, oh, Allison, what do you do? And I'm like, oh, I do mental health stuff and I also do harm reduction. They're like, what's harm reduction? And I'm like, like opioid training and things like that, talking about how to help out with the opioid thing was really huge before COVID hit, as a leading cause of death for a lot of people in the US. So I got naloxone trained, and then I talk about that. And then we start talking about like, there are lots of things that are weight dependent. So a friend of yours who may be over 120 pounds is going to have a way different experience than somebody who's like 195 pounds. So you have all these like tiny girls at raves passing out versus their boyfriends standing right next to them being like, I don't understand, we took the same thing. So yeah, it's starting a conversation and talking about like, I like to bring it back to alcohol because that's usually what people have an understanding with. It's the understanding that if someone gives you a glass of something and they say it's beer and it's actually a full thing of whiskey, like understanding what you need to do to get to the point in which you understand that you are about to take an entire thing of whiskey. And that has to do with like drug testing. That has to do like, there are test kits that you can find through resources, or you can get at-home drug tests. They are part of drug paraphernalia sometimes. So depending on where you are and what state, it may be legal or not. But yeah, just having conversations about like, there's a lot of good resources in the rave community. There's Roll Safe, there's Trip Safe. There's a bunch of them where they have science-backed information, giving you information about like what you could ingest, how you can find out what it is. The Chicago Recovery Alliance also has a bunch of resources about like, if you're going to do things, like think about the fact that if you are snorting something, you could possibly catch hepatitis C, which is something a lot of people don't think about. But once you're opening up your body to substances or like basically things that could pass a like mucus barrier and things like that, you're starting to have experiences where you have to worry about things like HIV or Hep C and things that just a lot of people, when they're going in to have a good time at a party, that's not something they're thinking about. So yeah, it's just about creating a public health experience where everybody is taken care of and you have the most information you can going in, hoping that you have a good time.
Thank you. And I we were happy and excited to have you as a part of this because, as the running narrative here is, people accessing substances which may have a recreational reality to them, but this is also the realm, so-called the street, where people also were initially accessing drugs and substances as tools for self-care, because what prohibition does, what stigma does, putting these things in a dark corner leaves people ill-equipped and effectively offending for themselves. And aside from the institutional bullshit that comes along with that, over-policing, incarceration rates and things like that, the human-to-human experience inside of prohibition is almost lethal. There's a lot of people who, even when you think of certain celebrities who have the financial capacity to get whatever they want, and they're dropping dead because the substances that they've been systematically using for a very long time suddenly get laced with fentanyl, and they go down by the wayside. one of the things I always bring up to folks who have a very adamant belief in things like prohibitions and in Schedule 1 enforcement and things like that is everyone who's listening and watching right now or in days and future beyond, there is absolutely a deleterious effect to any substance, okay? There just is. You anything that impacts your body, and I don't just mean that in the wishy-washy, like too much of anything can be bad for you. Anything that's a chemical, anything that's a substance that you put in your body can have different effects. Using that as the underlying basis to reject the positive potential benefits something has is a cop-out, it's bullshit, and it's a historic scapegoat. And the way I put this is I don't endorse positively or negatively alcohol use, okay? Regardless of what science suggests the lack of medical benefits that alcohol consumption may have. When people ask, well, drugs, whatever they are, drugs, everything in the drug world, how can you justify when you think about the death and the murder and the this and the that in the narcotic trafficking world? And the only thing I would put into there is that, is it cannabis? Is it mushrooms? Is it even things that we're not talking about having a testable medical response like cocaine and heroin and opium and things like that? Is that the thing that's the killer, or is it the prohibition? And if you want to argue with that, all I would say is, what is Budweiser's month-to-month budget for armed guards for their delivery trucks? Because I know we kind of know what Al Capone's was, but like, what, you know what I'm saying? Like on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday morning, if you're in a city or passing a 7-Eleven and you see that alcohol truck of any brand, take your pick, loading and unloading and filling up the racks again, all right? He's got the door wide open. Homie's just doing his job. He's paid, he's got a retirement. And that's all because of regulation. So here we are. I'm kind of pivoting over to Patrick. This is an uncomfortable part of this reality. It should not be a discussion for anyone listening and watching right now. It should not be a discussion. Can substances have a positive medical impact? Can they have a positive therapeutic impact? Can even recreation, which in and of itself is therapeutic, letting loose steam, can these things have a positive impact? Hell yeah. Is there a negative? Yeah. Anything irresponsibly done or uninformed can be freaking harmful. A chainsaw is motherfucking lethal if you don't know how to fucking use it, okay? But Patrick, another part about this, in a lot of ways, and I'm not trying to make you feel uncomfortable or put you on the spot, but in a lot of the ways, if somebody, coming from a more radical side for legalization was sitting here, and maybe that's me, in a lot of ways, you could be the very face of the problem, in that now we're going to legalization and we're going to recreation, and you can connect with the situation through your family, the family connection, you take a legitimate interest, but there's a lot of people saying, well, look, a lot of brown people were hurting. So how did you get in, and how do you get the service, and why do you get to be a part of this conversation before others? And that's not an attack. I think it's important that we understand that there is no prejudice to the usage, but yeah, I think it's important.
Oh, absolutely, Carl.
Yeah.
No, there's so much to unpack here. And you make a great point, and I appreciate everyone on the panel's specificity around not just cannabis, but psychedelics and other substance use forms. It's super, super enlightening. But on the topic of social equity, that's by far one of the most challenging aspects in our marketplace, given the prohibition on cannabis and social injustice that we're not just seeing currently, but systemically over the years and involving cannabis. One of the key things for us in rural and for our cultivation in rural Illinois is what it's done for our rural economy. While we may not be the most diverse in respect to race, we are certainly a Rust Belt-like region in Illinois. We've been fortunate with our operation to employ up to 100 in our community, in our tri-county, call it roughly tri-county area in Western Illinois. Through that experience, it's offered a lot of education, not just for us, but for the folks that work for us. On the topic of prohibition, I kind of think back, and we have the opioid epidemic still alive and well. I think it's taken a back seat, obviously, recently with the current events of the day. But growing up in Western Illinois, it was meth was and still is. And it's just it's unfortunate because there's only so much that can get packed into the daily news cycle. And, growing up, what gets lumped in with meth, cannabis, other, what we look at now as plant-based medicines in a more progressive climate. But 20, 30 years ago, that gateway and the stigma around cannabis really, it was difficult, I think, for a lot of people in certain, and even, not even in rural, but even in cities too. I mean, getting over that hurdle of the stigma and the gateway aspect to it. Social equity wise, Illinois' regulated program is thought to be one of the best in the nation. Governor Pritzker passed last summer. There are pathways for more diversity into this industry. But so much has changed since 2014. We went from a period of time where it took some real bipartisan measures to even get a medical cannabis program, which is crazy to think about in 2020. And since Governor Pritzker was elected, he's really pushed for some more progressive measures. So on that front, we're very fortunate. We have a long ways to go in respect to social equity and diversity in our industry. As a grower, we would love to see more retail partners that are, not to say mom and pop, but people who are more interested in just running their own shop and working, building a community. As a grower, and I think Alia can attest to this, our product portfolio, I wouldn't say is necessarily more or less unique than other cultivators. I think what we try to do in addition to quality, consistent quality product is really just our outreach and collaboration. And it sparked the conversation that we've just gotten going with Hope for the Day. And then our partnership as a partner for freedom with Last Prisoner Project, who's working nationwide and across North America, really, in terms of trying to work on social justice initiatives, reentry program, clemency. So we're all on board there, absolutely. And Alia, if I could just add to your points as well, we talk about different conditions this can help with. The challenge we're faced with is chronic. We have chronic pain and anxiety that we hang our hat on with cannabis use. And then from there, you really try to drill down. And we have a portfolio of edibles, flower, different vaping options. But in Dr. Felty, Daniel, I mean, you guys have obviously all experienced this. It's hard right now to pinpoint what use form works for the individual, the physiological effects, what helps you with your sleep. Is it an indica, or are we confusing an indica with a hybrid that is really not as dynamic as what maybe it's being preached to be? So that's, I think, our challenge going forward, is that physiological benefit of a chocolate bar relative to flour, and what type of flour. So we have a lot of work to do there. I can appreciate your comments, Daniel, in respect to your experience. And, while we've gotten over that hurdle into a regulated market, we still have a tremendous amount of way to go on education and finding a way to find, the proper use forms for the specific person. That's a big time challenge. And there's a lot of groups out there looking to try to do that. And I think we feel comfortable with our current position, but we know we've got a lot more to do there. So.
Thank you for saying that. And I hope you didn't feel like I was putting you on the spot, but at the same time, it would be irresponsible not to look at these parts from our side in terms of this is a platform to have, a conversation about the whole thing and not shy away from parts, because, even folks, when we think about like Last Prisoner Project and Illinois, like a lot of other states that are approving recreational, that it became a secondary, but they now understand like they need to create legislation for addressing incarcerated individuals. And I don't like to use the term crime. And this gets messy for people because I go back to, this is a very direct in the face part about this, is that, you know, violence connected to illicit narcotics trades is in and of itself not the virtue of the narcotic, but is a part of prohibition. That should not exalt if somebody's committed murder. Unfortunately, you know, harm to the community is not, you know, provable, even if you're compelled to by the professions that you've gotten into. Okay, you know, I'm not going to make a case for, well, Pablo Escobar could have been a real person of the people. Yeah, he's funding a lot of people and changed a lot of communities, but there was a level that unfortunately he crossed, and that's not an excuse. What I'm saying is, like, that's how messy this is that now that we're making a conversion and people are trying to get to a regulated place, there are a lot of individuals who find themselves incarcerated under the auspices of crimes that, for a large part of society, they're going to continue to say that these are criminals and crimes. And possession and maintaining, and even the fact is, you know, to be brutally frank, and I can feel like part of my board is going to cringe right now, you know, people who are even part of the commerce of it are only committing a crime in so much the name of the laws written on paper, but aren't necessarily crimes against, you know, the community and the public. And, you know, I put an asterisk there about, like, I hope you have not taken a human being's life, even if so compelled to, for your own self-defense. But my point being is, like, so some of them with possession, they can get out of jail, great. These people need to go. And I transfer or pivot over to, I think everyone should be able to comment on that, but I also want to rope in here from Daniel, from your point. If on one side of this, we're talking about the criminal aspects of prohibition and stigmatization, I also want to talk about the personal aspects, and that, and Dr. Felty, you can also jump in specifically on this part too, about when they say holistic, when they say hallucinogenic. Daniel, as you're telling your story, it's easy for me to hear people, if they can't relate to the incarceration part and the oppression part, they may hear your journey and be like, well, that sounds like some hippy dippy bullshit. Like, you just want some sort of, like, and it's actually inappropriate to say, like, spirit walk, because we need to reserve that back, you know, for indigenous folks to take claim of that term. But, like, you went on some sort of hippie journey, saw, you know, whatever, you saw Grover in the clouds, and so you want to hug and live everybody, but that doesn't mean you got better, buddy. Like, I don't know why I take that tone either, but that might have been stigmatized to Southern folks. But so I'm sorry. But so Daniel, like, what are your, that is a stigma though too. That can hinder people from taking your experiences and this movement seriously if they just think this is just one excuse for everybody to go and get into a love fest, which ain't nothing wrong with a love fest, but, like, let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so then the experience probably isn't for you and you don't need it. And that's what I tell people. I'm not selling anything. I am just telling people what worked for me, and I've tried everything else, and it could work for you, but it might not. So that's kind of where I draw the line, and I highlight science, highlight the data, highlight things like the US government owns patents on all non-psychoactive cannabinoids. And they took out that patent in 2003 as antioxidants and neuroprotectants to protect against damage of the brain and degeneration. So think about that. Back in 2003, they took that out, right? And it's a Schedule 1 still, along with psilocybin, that says it's highly addictive. The non-psychoactive cannabinoids are highly addictive, and they have no medicinal value. So just try to digest that for a second. And then I really don't need to say much more about, you know, the war on drugs was more so a war on people. And I think we all have touched upon that in some way, shape, or form. And Dr. Felty touched upon it. With decriminalized nature, it's about healing over profits. It's about a grow, gather, and gift model. It's about using community leaders to go in and pass on the education from Dr. Felty, from mycologists, to teach these community leaders how to grow, educate them on responsible use, because everything that we talk about here, no matter the schedule, we want people to use responsibly, because this can really help, but it can also hurt, just like anything, right? Food can hurt. I mean, over intake of sugar. So just understanding what these things do, understanding that 80 to 90% of our serotonin receptors are in our stomach. So what we eat directly relates to the chemicals that are being produced in our brain. So it's really important. So again, it just goes to education. And I think you have to give that to community leaders because that's who they listen to. And there's a lot of traumatized communities out there. We see that. And luckily, what this medicine does, the entheogens that we're talking about, which are ayahuasca, cacti, psilocybin, iboga, they have a tendency to exasperate what is wrong with you. So in my experience, I managed the dosage, which is number one. I had an experienced guide, which is number two. I had the right set, which is the right mindset of why I wanted to do it. I wanted to regain my brain health and figure out what was next in life because I was totally lost. And then I had the right setting. I was at a farm in Colorado. And so if you manage all of those things and then you communicate with your guide afterwards to integrate the lessons learned from the ceremony into your everyday life, you can make some huge gains. If you take 5 grams and go to a concert, you can go into psychosis. So it's just a matter of understanding what these are and their tools, and they're a technology, and we call it a technology because indigenous tribes have perfected this over tens of thousands of years, and they perfected it with sound and with visuals and with fire, and so I think it's just really important. If you expect to buy your CBD at a gas station, you deserve for it not to work. That's not where we're buying medicine, okay? And so if you don't see a COA from seed to flower to batch, if you can't track the lot number on each ingredient, then that's a problem. You shouldn't be taking that medicine. There are no regulations right now with CBD. And so I think you should really, you gotta educate yourself about what you're ingesting in your body. And so, everything that I take was PhD formulated. I'm growing 2 acres this year. So I went from 750 plants to 4,000. We're growing indoor. I'm growing with an 88-year-old veteran in Illinois. We have COAs on seed. We'll have it on flower and batch. It's all organic. We have USDA certified organic mushrooms that we use. And you can track and see all of it. And I think that you just need to be really transparent with people. And then on the psilocybin side, again, it's PhD formulated, and just trust your source, but you have to educate yourself. And this is not me telling anybody to go out there and do this on their own, but to Dr. Felty's point, do you know how confident I am now in my recovery process? Because I can see when I'm isolating, I can see when my communication's going awry. And now I know exactly how to administer medicine in the comfort of my own home and have an amazing experience. And there is it's hard to describe how much confidence that gives me in anything I do now in my life. So.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in real quick and add to that point. So when in harm reduction, sometimes I talk to people who have been having a great time, having a terrible time, had this one thing not work out very well, had something else be not what they were expecting. And once you start giving them education and understanding where perhaps they went wrong or where they didn't get enough information or where they could change the setting, change their friend group. Sometimes you have people who are not there to help you, and that could have a huge difference no matter what you're taking. Even if you're just taking pot and you're paranoid that the person next to you is going to be an asshole, that's huge. So yeah, all those things are super important. And I like watching people the first time we talk being like, oh man, Allison knows a lot of things. Okay, I guess I'll take some of these things. And then seeing them a couple months or a year later where they have had positive experiences because they can control what they're doing is huge.
I also wanted to tap in really quickly. And I think to what Daniel was saying, it's so crucial to not only have the right tools, but to also have the right people well-versed and educated to have that conversation, to be able to foster a very healthy view and conversation on what healing could look like through plants, through alternative medications, especially for youth who have been oppressed and who have seen our people oppressed for years, being able to say, hey, this is the correct way that you do it. Are you drinking water? Have you gotten enough sleep for the night? What does your home look like? Do you have your own space? Are you on your phone all night, on Instagram, scrolling all day? What energy are you taking in that could negatively affect your ability to live a life full of dignity and integrity? And then let's also mirror that, and let's also match that with some treatments and some ailments that could only further amplify like such a healing and holistic well-being.
That's, I was thinking of an anecdotal thing, and I don't know if it has a perfect placement here or not, but I also think of like there's a cultural divide there too, in that if you think about the spaces in which people have been given opportunity to use the recreational approach to things, I think of like a jam fest and festival type thing, and even a rave type thing, versus like a hip hop concert, your stoop corner. And I grew up navigating, I grew up in a suburb, in a Mayberry, and into my teens and early 20s navigating into urban spaces as well. And I could, by the time I was 12, I had they were a parent of somebody, tell me like, hey man, I went to Woodstock, and like, you guys smoking, if you're doing any shroom stuff, like here's what you got to do, like you gotta be careful, you gotta take care, drink a little water, man, like just be, and it kind of real like sort of a trope almost, okay, of a person. And that was the insight. And I remember the first, this one time I was in an urban space with some folks, and these guys had not had the same input. They didn't have the same cultural like access. So it was just pot, but like I'm 15 and this is all on the illicit side or the prohibition side, right? I'm 15 and I'm looking at them and be like, this is amateur hour. Like you guys are going to like just crash and burn doing these things. But they didn't know, like the elders around them had only accessed things a certain way. And when would they have had an opportunity to go somewhere for 16 hours, 2 days, set up a camp tent, blaze, shroom out, stare at the sky, and not be brutalized, hassled, or bothered by law enforcement or other agencies, tell them to get off of a farm field, right? So I just throw it in there because it makes me wonder, like, Alia, how much a lot of your education work is actually with folks in the dispensaries, in the industry, not necessarily street side per se, right? Whereas Michelle, you're doing a lot of, sort of to the direct general public. How much education, what's the learning curve that they need? Even people who are like, they're totally down, this isn't controversial, like they want to support, but what's their level they need?
I mean, there's some people that don't have any education at all, and it's specifically in the dispensaries, there's not a lot of, it's mostly hands-on training. There's not a lot of training prior to being in the industry. And, so that's one of the things that I would really like to do is be able to make sure that people understand. So we have Nature's Grace has a thing like to be able to learn the strains, to be able to talk about the terpenes, to be able to talk about, the different effects that the flower potentially could have. Obviously it's individual, the reaction is individual to each person. So, it's just, there's not enough information for the budaristas and for, even some of the people that own the dispensaries. I mean, it's a business. Nature's Grace is not like that, because their motto is, patience over profit. So we want to make sure that things are correct, that they're properly dosed, that it's consistent all the time. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to work for Nature's Grace, because when I got an opportunity to go to the grow and meet Mr. O'Hearn, and he almost made me cry when he was talking about, like, that it's been a hard road. It's not all, roses with having, lots of money and blah, 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 but like that they make sure that it's consistent for their patients because they really care. And that's one of the things that I really liked about their company, because they actually cared about the people. And so, yeah, the bud tenders, the budaristas, what we like to call them, they need a lot of training, they need a lot of training, and they need a lot of, just this plant can help this, or this can help this. They don't have that knowledge unless they're willing to look it up themselves. So we want to make sure that we can, speak to them on that, as well as the mental health aspects that cannabis can have, to help, and just how to navigate their own days as well with their own personal mental health. Because, I mean, not so much now since it's recreational, but when it was just medical, you would internalize a lot of people's trauma because, they obviously they're ill, and have some sort of condition that is allowing them to come into the store. So a lot of times you would become their therapist, and have to really explain to them about the product, which was one of the most fun things I think I liked the best, because I could teach people, since I'm, a teacher, I was a teacher for a long time, to be able to specifically teach people about the product or how to use a product. Oh, I've been smoking longer than you've been alive. You don't know what you're talking about. It's like, okay, well then you go do you. And then they would come back the next time and be like, oh, I should have maybe listened to you on that dosing. Maybe I shouldn't have eaten a whole syringe of RSO. You know what I mean? Like, so it's like, well, you do you. And when you figure it out, then you can come back and I'll help you, because I told you so. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done with just the regular population and people in the industry. So
I would also like to say, oh, sorry. I was also going to say that I think there's a stigma attached to knowing more than the average person, which is huge.
Yeah.
Because when you're too knowledgeable, people are like, oh, well, either she wants to ruin my good time,
right?
Or how does she know all this? There's no way I've been doing this longer. How do you know? So yeah, there's an additional stigma of people like waiting for people to catch up to be like, oh, they've learned, they know stuff, maybe I should listen to them. But yeah, a lot of these, because a lot of it's been counterculture, there's like this weird raw drive to like just be in the chaos and be okay with like, I took some shrooms, I don't know how much it was, but I had a trip, and not knowing enough to actually have a real conversation about like, what was your dose? How was your experience?
To use it as medicine. Yes. And that's the thing I try to tell people all the time. It's like, hey, you can use this product and you can have a great time and you can use it recreationally and do whatever you want. But if you're really truly using it as a medicine, then you need to know what you're using. You need to know how much works for you. What's your dosage going to be? How often should you take it? Should you microdose all day, or should you just take, 10 milligrams at night before bed? And so talking the science with patients specifically at the dispensaries, they would be like, what? And we would make them write it down. We would be like, here's a journal, write this down, write your, how did it make you feel? What were your effects after a half an hour, after, 2 hours? It's like a science experiment. That's what I would always tell them. Like, it's a science experiment. You need to practice on yourself where you're comfortable at home, and give very specific directions to people so they don't have those crazy anxiety attacks, when they're out in the middle of wherever, or, that they can still function throughout the day and be able to get their work done if they're still going to work, and just, destigmatize the whole thing and just be like, look, just think of it as if you're doing a science experiment. You need to make sure that your environment is controlled, just like Daniel and Dr. Felty both said, and you, Allison, as well. Like, you can't just take, 50 milligrams of something and then expect to go shopping. That's not going to work. That's not going to work for most people. There are people that can, but, those people know their dosages. And it's like, they sell these products, and we don't have any that are like this, but, that are like way over the top, and it's like, why? There's no reason that needs to be that much of a product, like, to use, other than just to be blasted. If you're using it medicinally, then it needs to be properly dosed, as most of the things at the dispensaries are. And for the legacy market, Carl, which is like the street dealers, like, those legacy market people are geniuses. And it's so unfortunate that a lot of those people are incarcerated. Over 40,000 people are incarcerated right now for minor marijuana issues. Sorry, my mouth got stuck there. Right now, which is crazy to think that that's still a thing. And of course, they're mostly Black and brown people. So, obviously there's that huge despair, but we want to try to make sure that we can get the information out, which is important, the education for the kids and older adults as well, because, they always think that they know more than anybody else. And, and also get that fair treatment for those people that are incarcerated, and have them come into the system of the cannabis industry, because they are the original legacy market and they know their shit, you know, so that's something that's super important. We need to do that.
Yes, Alia. If I could,
Please.
Alia, I just want to say that I'm super excited to team up with you and Nature's Grace, because for everyone who's watching and doesn't know, Alia was going to be coming to my office in Lincoln Park from Nature's Grace and doing a whole presentation on the education, the strains, the conditions, the risks, the benefits, because Alia, like you said, patients have no idea that one, medical cannabis is even available to them in Illinois. So a lot of times I'm educating them, you know, if they're trying to get off alcohol, if they have anxiety, if they have insomnia, whatever it might be, or a chronic illness, I will educate them and say, hey, have you thought of getting a medical cannabis card? And they're like, oh, no, I didn't even know. Is that legal? You know, they're so unaware that they have this resource.
Yeah, and it's that whole stigma around it. Like, I can't, excuse me, I can't go to a dispensary, you know, and that's, a lot of people would come for their parents because their parents didn't want to come into the store. And it's like, well, because they have this perception of this stigma that they always have of what a typical person that uses cannabis looks like, and that it's scary, and that there's like, you know, creepy people, or it's all thuggy, or whatever their perception is. It's like, you know, they would come into the specific dispensary that I worked at, and it was beautiful inside, and they're like, this is not what I thought this would be like. And it looked like a Starbucks, you know? I mean, it was like, well, what did you want it to look like? And so just breaking that, like just getting people in the door to see that it's not scary, you know, that it can be, it's a controlled atmosphere. Everything is labeled, like Daniel was saying, like you can track where it came from. All that is so super important. And if people don't know, then how are they ever going to, you know, use it properly? So.
Yeah.
And Dr. Felty, too, further to that point, especially I was thinking about what was Allison was saying a little earlier. You know, okay, so if there's stigmas and sort of pushbacks on like there's institutional deficiencies and things like that, let's talk about people like the individual themselves. An obstacle doesn't necessarily have to be the conditioning of, oh, it's evil. What about if, you know, as with all things, there's the too cool for school factor of like, you know, I remember the first time I heard the word CBD, okay, and somebody was telling me about it, and I'm sitting there being like, well, you know, I know the no, bro. Like, high science to me was like, you know, was like whether I'm going to use a steamroller or something, and somebody was like, well, there's CBD, and I'm like, well, what's that? Like, is that just another strain? Like, I mean, another strain, who cares? But my point being is like asking questions and asking about these things was something I was not in the beginning. Like, I didn't want to look like I didn't know what I was talking about. So like I didn't ask. And I was just like, oh yeah, you know, CBD, it's whatever. But do you find, like, Dr. Felty, and really probably all of you could add some of this, but do you find like that some people have that little hesitation, and that can be an obstacle to accessing treatment if they just don't want to ask, like, yo, can this actually, you know, I've tripped before, but like, what do you mean medically this can work, or therapeutically? Like, what does it mean?
Oh yeah. Well, first with CBD. So if I think that someone would benefit from CBD, which I think most humans will, but specifically if they have anxiety or insomnia, or they have inflammation going on, or stomach issues, then the first thing I think of to put them on is CBD. So I'll just ask them, you know, have you ever tried CBD? Do you know what it is? Would you be open to it? And usually they will say either yes or no, you know, is there THC in that? Or, you know, I get drug tested, or I don't want to get high. And then I have to educate them on the fact that they won't, you know, get high, and that it's non-psychoactive and all these other properties, and how it's really beneficial, and how it actually hits a system in your body called the endocannabinoid system. And when it hits all these receptors, it's actually, it produces epigenetic changes. And epigenetics is where the genes turn on and off based off of the environment. So like when we're stressed out or we eat processed food, we turn on genes for cancer and chronic illness. But we can turn them off when you get on raw foods and real food and relax and not stress ourselves out. So it's just educating them. And then with ketamine or psilocybin or MDMA, it really just depends on the person and what they're dealing with. Now, and if they're open, and I kind of intuitively feel that, if it's someone who's over 60, I'll talk to them about it and kind of, beat around the bush a little and talk to them about what they've done for their mental health. And, I'll ask them their experiences. And if I think that they're open, I might tell them, and educate them that there are some mental health resources out there for you that is not just an antidepressant, or that isn't just, something else that you've been trying that isn't working. And then I might tell them about ketamine and how it's available now in Illinois and how to do that in a healing way. I also might tell them about psilocybin and how to do it in a healing way. I also have been offering pre and post integration sessions for psychedelic experiences, because integration is the most important part, because you go through a beautiful, sometimes scary, and then beautiful again experience, this roller coaster of emotions during an experience. And to process that and integrate that in is really the therapy that happens. And I just think that everyone has a right to break free from self-inhibiting and self-limiting thoughts and beliefs and trauma that they've been conditioned to think, that's limiting their personal growth, and explore their own consciousness. And I'll tell them this, in order for you to live your life in a place of highest awareness, which I think a lot of people lack self-awareness, and that's what really causes them a lot of suffering. And I think that these plants and these fungi and these medicines facilitate this pursuit. And I just tell them that and educate them on that. And I let them know it's illegal, and I can't tell you where to get it. And I can tell you to go to Colorado. I can tell you to go to Oakland. I can tell you to go to different psychedelic psilocybin retreats and tell you how to do it in the most healing way. But unfortunately, until it's decriminalized, that's all I can say.
That's very informative. And as we're sort of winding down here, because there's probably no limits to where we can go with these conversations.
Oh, and Carl, I'm sorry. Well, one more thing, just because you asked, do I get hesitance or like resistance? And I do want to say that some people feel like it's scary. Like they kind of go, oh, I don't know if I want to do that. That kind of sounds scary. Like ketamine sounds scary, or, resolving my trauma, or, dissolving my ego, and, going through these things. I don't know if I'm ready for that. And I honor that. And I tell them, when you're ready for it, just let me know, and I can educate you on where to go and what to do. But everyone has their own path and their own journey. And I think everyone's ready for these types of medicines at their own pace and at their own time. And I think it's important to respect that in all medications and things. So that's it.
No, that's perfect. And I as we're winding down here, I think it's going to be necessary. As you've seen with some other episodes, I think what we're going to do is we're going to copy and paste this block, and we're going to have to come back again to talk about more. Each one of you have been able to provide insight in phenomenal intersections on this conversation, in which, juggling between the impact and the collateral damage of the war on drugs and stigmatization, talking about the very real, and I want to double down on this part, very real benefits that these tools have, these substances have in our lives, and the different nuances, accessing them and understanding them and whatnot. I would like to hear from each of you, as you feel comfortable, sort of what might be a sort of take home you'd like our listeners and watchers to have with them for this one phase, because we're never going to get everything in one conversation. That's why we need to come back and keep having them. But I would like you to sort of give us like two pieces of a soundbite. One, remember that all of the organizations and things that you have mentioned, we will be copying and pasting, reiterating, and posting in our material. So don't worry about a loss on those things. We've been keeping a track on them. But maybe give a little sign off of what you like our listeners and watchers to know and take with them from your perspective. And also make sure plug things that you'd like people to know about you. So I think that's important professionally. Starting with Allison.
Yeah, I think the first thing would be don't always, because I've worked in a lot of festivals and rave spaces, and when it comes to opioid use and things like that, do your own research. Just because someone gives you something and says that it is what it is, there are a lot of excellent resources that I'm sure will be linked somewhere in this podcast or YouTube that you can look at yourself and make your own choices. You never have to do anything that someone just hands to you. It's always your call. So yeah, just have the confidence to care enough about yourself to get that education.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Sorry. I have a lot to say. I think we could do this one over a number of times. There's a lot to touch on. As far as, you know, our role and work in this industry, I think we're only as good as our community, folks that we collaborate with. You know, if I think back at my upbringing and my family, and Alia touched on it a little bit, you know, if maybe some types of farming and agriculture have always been really good for some folks, it certainly has been a roller coaster for my family. I was born in the early 80s, and my parents kind of going through a farm economy depression. We were livestock, and we still have cattle. In 1998, we got knocked out of the pork business because of the larger corporates that are now kind of dominating the meat packing sector. That kind of forced us to reinvent ourselves as a cow-calf operation in corn and soy. Only until about the late 2000s, early 2010s did the cattle market really show some form of profitability that was worthwhile. It's been a struggle, and probably more so globalization in Western Illinois has really hurt. Our Maytag factory in Galesburg went to Mexico in the late 90s. Put a lot of people out of work, and we've seen Caterpillar downsize in Peoria. And so the opportunity to put more people to work in the rural economy, it's depressed. And we talk about the war on drugs and what that's done to Black and brown people in the inner city in these urban areas. There's a connection there to be made that I think cannabis is one of the more, it's a hot topic, but it's also one of the most inclusive industries that I've had a chance to be part of, from all of the different backgrounds of people kind of coming together to try to make this a compliant and regulated market. It's really, really expensive in order to do that right now. The hope is that as we move forward, we can find a better balance in terms of getting more quality product at a more reasonable price. Because like Alia pointed out as well, there's some really, really wonderful people that have operated in that gray to black market that deserve a place in this industry if they're not already in it. So there's a lot more work to be done. I would like to point our audience to Cannabis Matters. So it's an ancillary platform of ours. It's cannabismatters.com, cannabis-matters.com. It's a nice resource, largely focused on the state of Illinois in terms of how to get a card and different education elements and resources. So I really want to thank everyone for having me on. It was a wonderful time. There we go.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Patrick. Michelle.
Oh, yes, I can echo everything everyone has said. I'm so encouraged by the ability to have this conversation so openly and so candidly, with the connected thread of our personal lived experiences. I think my antidote or my takeaway for any parents or any educators or anyone that might have youth in their care, don't be afraid to, number one, educate yourself and to understand the many different ways you can have a conversation on how to foster a healing space for your youth. And number two, don't be afraid to explore your child's curiosity and to be that kind of first defense on the right education your child is getting versus them getting it from a classmate at school or from someone they know down the street in the hood. Like, be that light for them and the right conversation. So thank you so much for having me. I can't wait for the next one.
So awesome. Thank you, Michelle. Dr. Felty?
Thanks, Carl. I'm super grateful to be here with all of you guys. I'd say the last thing for everyone out there, you can heal yourself. And I don't think you're taught that enough. When it comes to mental health issues, there is a holistic approach out there that looks at vitamin deficiencies, nutrition, toxins, these types of medicines, along with fasting and meditation and yoga and breath work. There's so many holistic or alternative therapies out there that have tremendous science behind them. So if you are stuck, in your treatment, or you are dealing with mental health issues like so many people of us are, especially now in these times, I just want to encourage you that you can heal and you can feel better. And there might be another way for you, but it's important that you look for it. Thank you, guys.
Daniel?
Yeah, I guess what I would like to end on is something that Allison touched upon, is just know where your medicine is coming from. And medicine includes your food. I encourage people to, make a little home garden and grow your own food, and you can even grow your own medicine legally. And just understand what you're reading, who you're reading it from, who pays that person, and then make an educated decision on what may work for you. And I encourage people to make a deeper relationship with yourself, so then you're better enabled to recognize signs and symptoms that are affecting your quality of life, and recognize them repeatedly, and then move into what works for you, because what works for me may not work for you. So I try to talk about a whole host of different things. And you can find me at Decriminalize Nature Chicago for that movement. I'm at Daniel Carcillo 13 on Instagram, both on Instagram. I sit on the board of the Heroic Hearts Project, so check them out. They're a 501c3 that connects veterans with ayahuasca and other entheogenic therapies and retreats. And then I'm launching Made Plant Health, which is the CBD functional mushroom line that helped me recover my brain health and my quality of life in July. And you could head to my Instagram and show what we're growing basically on the daily, and a lot of sprinkle the infield with some information about psilocybin and what's going on there. I'd encourage people to look at Yes on IP34 in Oregon. They just collected enough signatures where they're going to be on the ballot in November. Denver is moving towards the ballot in 2022 for legalization. So there's decriminalization, and then there's legalization, and then there's a whole host of different models that that people can access these therapies. So do your research, and thank you for putting this together.
Thank you, Daniel. Very informative. And lastly, but not leastly, Alia?
Thanks, Carl, for having me on again. You guys are all awesome, so thank you for letting me be in your space, because everybody here is just fantastically informative and knowledgeable, and I love that. And obviously, we want to continue this conversation and continue to spark the conversation about mental health and cannabis specifically, but also all other plant medicines too, because people just need to be educated. That's, I think, everybody that has closed out has said the same thing. It's all about education. If we don't get people educated, it's just the cycles are just going to perpetuate, and people are going to continue to have those stigmas, and they're just never going to go away. And we need to make sure that we keep pushing forward to tell people that these things are okay, with the right place and the right mindset, and that it's okay to try these things. And if they don't work for you, then they don't work for you. But you've at least explore those different avenues. You know, if you're, like Dr. Felty said, if your regular medicine isn't working, then try something else. And don't be afraid to talk to your doctors too, and tell them that this is something that you've researched, you know, and you need to take it upon yourself to do the research too. But, you know, to speak to your doctors and be like, this is something I researched and this is something I would really like you to, you know, be on board with. And if they're like, no, then find a different doctor, you know, because ultimately a doctor works for you. If they don't agree with what you're asking them to do, then you need to find somebody else that's going to be able to help you, obviously in a safe way. So yeah, we just need to keep pushing the education envelope and just, you know, letting people know, like I said, that it's okay. These things are okay. And we just want to make sure that we keep talking about it, because if we don't, it just, you know, stays with silence. And we know that silence is the problem, right, Carl?
And before I wind us down, I wanted to make sure, because I think we oversight it. Dr. Felty, don't you have a website people can find you at?
Oh, yes. It's drfelty.com. And you can email me as well. It's info@drfelty.com. And then on Instagram, my handle is just Dr. Felty. Thanks, Carl.
Okay, I was about to say. So I want to thank.
Can I start the conversation real quick? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah.
I totally forgot.
Yes. Our the episode. Well, go on.
Go ahead. No,
you got it. Go.
All right. So the title of this obviously is Spark the Conversation. So Nature's Grace and Wellness has a partnership with Hope for the Day, yay, which is so awesome, to be able to take the information from the Things We Don't Say workshop that I've been practicing, and be able to go out and talk to different people in the cannabis community and the cannabis industry specifically, just about their mental health. So thank you.
Wait, Michelle.
I was gonna say thank you, Alia. So Cornerstore is actually going to be supporting Things We Don't Say for the month of July, and then take it a step further. I have been working closely with Hope for the Day. Shout out to Mike, to bring Things We Don't Say to communities that I serve and love and value most, Black and Brown communities. So if you are interested or you would like to connect with me and get that education series going, please reach out. I am so excited. Thank you guys so much.
Oh yeah, and just as doing some housekeeping, Daniel, sir, don't you have a podcast?
Yeah, I thought about that. The Daniel Carcillo Journey on Instagram and YouTube, and I also have a foundation, Chapter 5 Foundation, that helps athletes transition into life after the game. So.
Goddamn awesome. So, folks watching right now, listening today or in days future, I'm sure you are as blown away by our amazing guests as I am. And in closing out today, I want to drive it home, because oftentimes on Conversations Cafe, we know and we talk about why we're doing the thing, but sometimes people will look at the byline or look at the topic and be like, well, how is it suicide prevention? How is that mental health? And it's important to understand that Hope for the Day, our brand, our work, is that we pioneered something called proactive suicide prevention. And our goal is to start conversations before mental health adversely impacts our lives. But more specifically, what our precise work is designed to do is to create early intervention and to try to provide tools to disrupt the highest risk factors for mental health crisis and suicide. That's the baseline underneath all the have hope and it's okay not to be okay work. And why I say that right now is that when we talk about substances that I call tools, that have been called drugs, that have been called illegal, that have been called therapeutic, holistic, and otherwise, these are part of the bigger mental health game. They're part of the bigger self-care game. Right now, we're watching industries in the scientific and medical communities have to struggle and bring in consultants to merge physiological care and what's generally called behavioral health, which is the mental health field. And you might think that seems odd that you have to sort of like bring these two things together as if they're a mountain that's been split in half and has to be refused. But that's not, again, it doesn't have to be a nefarious, like evil conversation. It's just the body health and the mental health were always separated. Where substances like what we call drugs, narcotics, or therapeutic things, and I'm trying to be as vague as possible here, or broad as possible rather, these tools have been left on the sideline and not just dismissed because, oh, they're hippy dippy, fairies and elves prancing around in magical mystery worlds. There's been a conscious effort to segregate and move these substances away from the status quo for social and cultural reasons, and not just to protect profits of other kinds of pills and things, but consciously to try and alienate very powerful tools from our community and our conversations and from our access. And that's not just against African Americans. The fact that a lot of these tools and resources come from indigenous tribes, it is no accident that these things are then stigmatized as being otherworldly and things not to be taken seriously or dismissively called holistic, as opposed to embracing that term, because holistic sounds pretty damn good. But I want everyone to drive home on this part. Any kind of substance can be harmful, but the fact is that these tools, with responsibility and with education, simple education, you don't need to get a doctorate to learn how, as you all mentioned, can help heal yourself. And I say that both as a representative of Hope for the Day and also just closing out on a little lived experience story here, that I'm a suicide survivor of multiple attempts, and a lot of my experiences were based in my youth. But I had several attempts between the ages of 11 and 14. And June 24th, 1999 was the last time I tried to actively take my life. And it didn't just magically get better. But what did happen is at that same time, in those weeks and months at that period, I found regular and consistent access to marijuana. So let me tell you something. I did not have the education to know what the term self-care, coping mechanism was, or any of that stuff. I, in reflection, know as a fact that I used pot and alcohol and other drugs, but pot was my mainstay, my cornerstone. I used pot recreationally because I was using it for self-care, because the first thing I liked about pot was that I didn't have nightmares and I could sleep through the day. I didn't hate myself because the volume on the negative thoughts and aggressive angers and things that were symptoms of PTSD, the volume got turned down when my head was in the clouds. And I didn't know that that's self-care. I didn't know that those were coping mechanisms. And I just assumed it was part and parcel with the recreation. And as I got older and found a journey and a way to break through obstacles that kept me from connecting my issues with mental health, because we don't have conversations about our mental health in our communities, they're not normalized. And it wasn't something that I began that journey of professional cares and other supports till I was about 25. And as I went through that journey, I started to find tools to take care and address my traumas and the things that were challenging me in such a way that I came to a realization that I didn't necessarily need pot anymore. And the more I found supports for the trauma and the more I found healing, all that was left was the recreational side. And then for me, my journey, I found that I didn't really want the recreational experience anymore because it was tied to trying to cope with untreated mental illnesses and untreated wounds. And why I bring that up here as a full piece of disclosure is that if I had proper education, if we had illuminated access to all the tools that can be used to take care of our mental health. Because another thing about pot is that I didn't need health insurance, which my family didn't always have. I didn't need to schedule regular doctor's visits, and I didn't need to tell anyone, that I couldn't go a full night of sleep without these things. I didn't need any of that. It became accessible in an illicit way. And so I bring this up as a reflection point because I don't look, and you shouldn't look at substances as good, bad, or evil. They're tools. Tools are neutral. They're objective. They can be used for harmful realities. They can be used for positive and nurturing realities. And if you cannot separate pot, hallucinogenics, or anything else from that objective reality, then you are catching yourself buying into the conditioning that stigma has placed on these things. And so I tell my story about that because I don't blame anyone who finds as a deep level of support, plant-based pot, CBDs, any sort of mushroom, any sort of use of ketamine. If you find that as an essential part of your healing experience or your day-to-day management experience, I 1000% believe that it is in fact a critical tool. Even when so-called official science is lacking or insufficient to back that up, I want to let you know that that's not your imagination. Even if you already know that, it's important for us as communities to reaffirm that these things are not your imagination. You're not just finding an excuse to get stoned or get high. And if you've heard one thing from all these amazing people, I think, or one thing I want you to take away from all these amazing people is look at the connection here. Unlike a lot of other parts of the medical field and the mental health world and the clinical world in general, there's no compartmentalization. The people who are on the front lines creating, the people who are on the front lines educating, the people who are on the front lines prescribing and producing and sharing, they all have to be interwoven together, because this is a situation and this is an element that requires us as a community to really do the heavy lifting in the wake of all the destruction that stigmatization has done for these tools. And you look at each face who's on camera here, each one of them wants the best for their community and the best for the individuals in the community. And that's probably the most powerful tool you need to take with you. We need to push back against people who only want to have these conversations as, is it evil or not? That conversation is done, folks. Now it's just about learning what we need to do to understand for proper prescription, and who do we need to educate to further deregulate, to further regulate but decriminalize and get away from the prohibition and the things that have made this a harmful reality for millions of people. So I can't thank you enough for joining us. I want to thank all of our guests for helping illuminate, educate, and inform our audience. You're all amazing and wonderful people. Conversations Cafe cannot happen without the amazing support of Mike Van Opel, Rick Osowski, and Vicky Cisnet, who are the co-producers on Conversations Cafe. And I am so proud to have brought these amazing guests to you. I hope you all have a wonderful night. And please join us again next Thursday when we're on at the same bat time, same bat channel, 6 p.m. CST. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Yo!
What's up?
We about to feed 1,000 families on July 5th, bro.
Yes, we are. And,
Hello, miss.
I want to bring Christopher Lamarck on from Coffee, Hip Hop, and Mental Health.
Thanks for having me, man.
I'll ask
May I share this?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say this is that trauma has replaced their identity. You know? And like trauma would make you believe that you are not valuable, that you are not loved, that you are not necessary, and that is a lie. And I love that you all say over and over again, it's okay not to be okay. But what's not okay is not getting hurt. You have the permission, you are validated, we affirm you, but it's not okay to sit back and do nothing.